When Prince Shotoku launched the reform of the Japanese government and the imperial state, the Japanese government was modeled after that in Tang Dynasty China. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago with the Foundations of Japan lecture. We're going to talk today about the transition away from this model towards the feudal warrior aristocracy that would develop and rule Japan for 1,000 years, up until the late 1860s, all the way from the 11th century to the 1860s, but with its precursors coming a couple of centuries earlier. And that's the rise of the samurai and the creation of military government throughout the Japanese society and the cultural and political changes that came out of that development. So the emperor had absolute power in the same model as the Tang Dynasty. Prince Shotoku's system didn't allow for the mandate of heaven. The imperial family always had the mandate of heaven. There was never a point where their rule could be questioned or they could be legitimately overthrown. They were the descendants of Amaterasu Kami. They were descendants of the gods, the Shinto gods, and as such, they were divine themselves. Humanity did not have the right to question their authority, regardless of how wicked they might be. And so what ends up happening is you have a situation where you have an individual who cannot be questioned under any circumstances. And of course, when an individual cannot be questioned, ultimately they can't hold power because the system will become dysfunctional. So we end up with a system where regents end up holding the real actual power, and the emperors over time become reduced to figureheads. They have strong spiritual power. They're symbols of the nation. They're revered by every class of society, and this will continue until the Second World War. But the day-to-day affairs end up being run by government officials who can be questioned, right? Who can be held accountable for their policies, and it has to be that way. An unaccountable monarch is ultimately going to be reduced to ineffectiveness because the system becomes dysfunctional. So the first instance in which the imperial household began to lose its authority was due to the Fujiwara clan. The Fujiwara clan was founded by the courtier Fujiwara no Kamatari, and during the Heian period, the kind of height of classical Japan, the Fujiwara clan began to control the imperial throne through marriage alliances. What would happen is you'd have successive generations of emperors who the fathers were part of the Yamato clan, right? The traditional imperial clan that held absolute authority and was worshipped as divine. But the mothers would all come from the Fujiwara clan. So you have successive members of the Fujiwara clan rising to high office. They're marrying their daughters to the emperors, and so successive emperors are their grandsons, right? And of course, this is a society where grandfathers hold special authority, even maternal grandfathers. So these Fujiwara officials end up having power over very young emperors. And over time, the Fujiwara clan begins to handle the day-to-day affairs while the emperor is relegated to a ceremonial, symbolic role. So, and this is especially true when you have a child on the throne. If you have a child on the throne, his grandfather, and it's the system worked because his grandfather's not going to want to overthrow his grandson, right? He's going to want to strengthen the imperial institutions, the stability in the country. And the Fujiwara clan ruled Japan very well, despite the fact that they were taking power away from the imperial throne in the long run. So the imperial control weakened. You have intrigues and schemes between members of the Fujiwara clan and members of other clans in order to put their daughters in the households of the emperors and thus make them the mothers of the next emperor and the next generation. And you have uh, members of the high-ranking nobility who have at some point are descendants of the imperial family. And these are the great nobles who own vast amounts of land and property and have high-ranking roles in the state. And so these are aristocrats modeled after the Chinese model. They're very literate. They're very cultured. They are not soldiers. Their first calling is not arms. Now, many of them engaged in the profession of arms, but that was not their primary reason for existence. And what we're going to see over the succeeding centuries is that they're, in effect, overthrown by men whose first and foremost purpose is war. So how did the Fujiwara become prominent? Well, Fujiwara no Kamatari was an excellent politician, and they were the first to master this use of the Sessho, right, the regency for a child emperor, as I mentioned, and for the Kampaku, which is being the prime minister, more or less, to an adult emperor, usually because you're his grandfather or you're his great uncle or some other maternal relative. But they also gained a great amount of authority when due to the fact that their ancestor, Fujiwara no Hidesato, was a reported demon slayer. He slew an Oni, which is a big, burly, blue demon that lives in hell and comes out to feed on the living and has a big club, if you've ever seen Japanese mythology with those in them. But he also slew a giant centipede creature, according to traditional legend, right? And of course, these are legends. There's no basis in reality for them. We don't even know if Fujiwara no Hidesato was a real person. Nonetheless, the legend of Fujiwara no Hidesato, he's one of Japan's first great warrior heroes. And the way that he killed this giant centipede that was oppressing a princess, the dragon princess, a dragon who had morphed into a beautiful young woman. The way that he saved her is that no weapon could penetrate the exoskeleton of the giant centipede. And if you know anything about Japanese, the natural environment, they have gigantic centipedes and millipedes, very, very large, right? Surprisingly large species there, which is likely the basis of this myth. And one of the things that you're supposed to do when you see one is you're supposed to spit on them, right? It's supposed to harm them. Well, Fujiwara no, and this shows how much these things are reviled, because in Japanese culture, spitting is a huge no, right? I come from Mississippi with an agricultural background. Men spat all the time, whether they've got dip or chewing tobacco or whatever. In Japan, it is the opposite, right? It's a huge impropriety to spit. But Fujiwara no Hidesato spit on his arrow, and then he fired it at the centipede and killed it. Okay, okay, that was pretty funny. I love how lame some of the AI videos look, but I thought I'd stick a little humor in there. Okay, at least to wake anybody up who's who may have spaced out or dozed off. So, the decline of central authority is a major result of the Fujiwara family, right? So these regents begin to gain power. They begin to gain vast private estates called shoin, and the huge chunks of the provinces fall into the hands of these noble houses. And because they're falling into the hands of these private houses, these estates kind of become a law unto themselves, a kingdom unto themselves. So we have these vast estates being created by members of the nobility, and they're a law unto themselves, these massive shogun. And the imperial house is losing direct day-to-day political control. Well, that leaves a massive power vacuum. And many of these nobles in the Fujiwara clan and their rivals, their many enemies throughout the centuries, attempted to fill this vacuum. Well, one of the tools that they would use in competition with one another and to secure their lands were men called samurai. And samurai just means those who serve, right? Those who serve the great noble houses in the very beginning of their existence. They were not lords. They were not high and mighty and in charge. They were the paid bodyguards, effectively the mercenaries of these great noble houses. They knew how to fight, particularly they knew how to engage in yabusame, horseback archery, which was a dominant form of warfare at the time. So, because they could wield a sword, wield a spear, ride effectively, and fire from horseback, these men were essential to the designs of the great Fujiwara lords and the other members of the nobility. In the case of the Fujiwara, they would eventually become samurai themselves and adopt this militaristic warrior culture for themselves. But military power moves away from the emperor and moves towards the independent shogun in the provinces, these estates ruled by the great nobles. And because the samurai are now enjoying a monopoly of force, well, eventually they begin to enjoy a monopoly of political power. They don't remain the lowly bodyguards of the great nobles for long. In time, they become great nobles themselves. At least some of them do. Uh, Eventually, all of them will become part of a hereditary ruling class that will dominate society completely. The early samurai lived in a world very different from that of the imperial nobility in Kyoto. Uh, the samurai were much more meritocratic in terms of their rise in status. Now, most of them were born into relatively privileged backgrounds, but nonetheless, they were not members of the upper nobility, and you rose through the ranks due to your prowess at arms. So these men develop a value system based on loyalty, first of all, to their employers, the great nobles, and then to each other down the chain of command. And this loyalty to your direct lord, the lord above you in the feudal system, you're the lord, or he's the lord, you're the vassal, you serve him, he protects you. Right? This loyalty between lord and vassal, between master and servant, becomes the dominant ethos in their worldview. They stopped looking at the imperial court as a source of direction. Now they still revere the emperor, they still see him as a god, but they don't take day-to-day orders from Kyoto. They take orders from their liege lord, which for the high-ranking samurai are the nobles who are employing them. For the lower-ranking samurai, that's the higher-ranking samurai. So they begin to marry into each other's families. They establish family ties. They establish feudal ties of lord and vassal, of homage, paying homage, submitting to a greater lord who in turn bestows you with honors and with land, and then you do the same thing to samurai beneath you in the hierarchy. So we start to see a militaristic culture based on loyalty, based on personal honor, dueling, fighting, excelling on the battlefield, and that will all over time develop into what we call bushido. Right? The bushi just means warrior, right? And do is way, right? So uh, the bushido is just the way of the warrior, right? But it's an ethos that will in time come to dominate the entire society and will have massive ramifications even into the 20th century war with the United States that we'll talk about at the very end of our course or close to it. So uh, they live in a world where they're constantly competing for status, competing to commit great deeds on the battlefield, committing to protect their liege lords at all cost, even the cost of their life, and they gained great prestige and status as a result. And of course, we can't talk about an emerging warrior aristocracy without talking about their weapons. Their first great weapon was the yumi, or longbow, which was a bow that could be taller than a man. That is comparable more to the English longbow that was used in medieval Europe than the composite bows that were used in China or by Mongol warriors on horseback. Of course, in China, the crossbow was the dominant bow, but the yumi takes more skill, but a skilled archer could put many more arrows down the battlefield faster than a crossbowman could. And so the samurai trained with these extremely large, extremely powerful bows from boyhood. They were trained to use these bows on horseback, riding by enemies, peppering them with arrows, and then retreating, softening them up for an eventual charge, in which they would use long swords called tachi. And uh, tachi are they're different from katanas. I'm sure everybody's heard of katanas, but at this point, the 16th, 17th century iteration of the main sidearm of the samurai. Now, in the 16th and 17th centuries, most samurai, their primary weapon was a yari, a big spear, that a pole arm that sometimes was more like a halberd than a spear, but sometimes was a spear. And this is because this gave them great range, and as much stronger than the average foot soldier and much better armored and better trained. They were absolutely lethal with these. Their swords were primarily their sidearms, kind of like how a pistol would be to a modern infantryman. The M4 is his main weapon, or at least it was when I was in there. But I think they've switched to the Army switched to a new assault rifle now. So I don't know anything about it, but it was the M4. But you have your 45 if you choose to, or you can get it issued a 9mm if you want, Beretta. Um, but that'll be your sidearm, right? Well, the katana was a sidearm. Well, before the katana, you had the tachi, and the tachi was much more curved than a katana, and it was longer. The reason for this is it was meant to be used almost entirely from horseback, right? You were supposed uh, to ride by, and when you were done shooting at your enemy, you charged into them with your long sabers, and they're curved so that they could slice deeply and that they wouldn't get stuck in enemy corpses and hold you back while you're charging through enemy lines. The samurai also wore the uh, the very first iterations of uh, the traditional armor. And you'll notice that the different plates are extremely large, extremely blocky. They're much wider than they are dense, and this is because they're more designed to protect from arrows than they are sword cuts, or especially when we get to the late 16th, early 17th century, when samurai armor becomes designed uh, to withstand gunpowder weapons. So, uh, but these men are primarily used in mounted combat in this period of time. I have here pictured a tachi owned by Fukushima Masanori, who was one of the seven spears of Shizukatake. And the seven spears of Shizukatake were personal retainers of the great 16th century warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, whom we're going to talk about when we talk about the Sengoku Jidai era, the 16th, 17th centuries, the most famous samurai centuries, the period of Oda Nobunaga and uh, um, Tokugawa Ieyasu. So, but right now we're talking about a period about 500 years earlier, right? But this is one of the latest and last great tachi that were made before and it was outdated when it was made relative to katanas, but it is in such great condition, despite the fact that it's a 500-year-old sword, that it's worth $100 million, which makes it the most valuable sword in existence. And most swords like that have undergone massive degeneration, but not this blade. Okay. So I had mentioned how Yasame, the art of horseback archery, was a prominent part of samurai culture. One thing that samurai did that made them differ from many other armies in East Asia, particularly those in China or those of the Mongol Empire, is that they did not fight as units. They fought as individuals. They would seek out rivals, and they would have archery duels with each other from horseback, right? And these were great displays of prowess because the goal was to win individual honor, right? You want to win honor for your warlord. You want people to look at you and say, who's that? Who's his lord, right? So you end up having large numbers of soldiers who fought individually. So early on, the samurai clans gained military power, they gained prestige, they gained lands, they gained money, they gained status. It's only a matter of time before they begin to exert themselves politically. And that process began first with the Fujiwara, who over time kind of turned themselves into samurai. But the first true samurai clan to rise up was the Taira. The Taira were the first samurai to institute their own government. They began by serving the imperial court as military advisors, as counselors, and as bodyguards. And in time, they began to gain more and more prominent positions due to the fact that they were victorious in battle. They were particularly victorious in destroying piracy in uh, the the inland sea between Shikoku, Honshu, and Kyushu, which was a haven for piracy. So the trade with Korea and China, which was prominent in this period of time, could go on unaffected, which brought great wealth to the imperial court. Eventually, one of them rises up who is very politically astute, and that was Taira no Kiyomori. And he was the first samurai leader to really dominate the political system. Taira no Kiyomori was eventually made chancellor by the emperor. In fact, he was such a threat that the retired emperor, Go Shirakara, took part in a plot to have him killed, a plot that ultimately failed and further increased his power over the state. Eventually, Taira no Kiyomori will have his grandson, will have his daughter uh, uh, married to the emperor, and the new emperor, Emperor Antoku, will be his grandson. So he will have the ultimate power over the throne then when the young boy Emperor Antoku uh, rules. And of course, Taira no Kiyomori rules in his name. Taira no Kiyomori is an interesting figure. He has a bout with illness that almost kills him, so he takes the vows of a Buddhist monk and shaves his head, but he still continues to direct the state and the affairs of his family, despite the fact that he lives a very personally austere life, a life of celibacy and self-denial. So he's very much a self-made, authentic warrior, warrior leader. And because of this, he's greatly feared by many of his enemies. Some of the other samurai clans rise up against him, and he crushes them utterly. One of them, the most prominent of them, was the Minamoto clan. He defeated the Minamoto, and he killed their leadership, but he exiled their young sons and brothers further to the east to a place called Kamakura, where they would be away from the imperial throne in Kyoto. And of course, Taira no Kiyomori thought that he was safe doing this. But his sparing, particularly Minamoto no Yoritomo and Minamoto no Yoshitsune, two great leaders of the Minamoto clan, this would come back to bite him. The Minamoto clan were the main rivals of the Taira, and they were another one of these very powerful, very influential samurai families who won their authority and their political power on the battlefield. Uh, One of their leaders, Yoritomo Minamoto, had been exiled along with his brother Yoshitsune as a small boy. Taira no Kiyomori decided to spare him. He moved further to the east and built up a base of power around what's now Kamakura, which is not too far of a distance from Tokyo. So on the Kanto plain. And in Kamakura, he began to make alliances with different families who were related to his own and build up a coalition and a large army. The Taira were very powerful. They had a very strong navy. They monopolized the trade with China and Korea. They had the power of the imperial throne, and they had Taira no Kiyomori, who was an excellent leader. The Minamoto had some advantages, though, against the Taira. One is they generally were conceived of as the superior warriors. Right? They were kind of the far east of Japan at the time was considered the frontier. The Amishi, the descendants of the original Jomon people, if you remember them, they lived in the east and north of the main island of Honshu still at this period of time. And so these early samurai are fighting against the Amishi. In fact, much of the samurai's tactics, the curved blade of the tachi, the hit and run archery, those originated with the Amishi. So the Japanese began to adopt Amishi tactics in their battles. That's why when you look at China, when you look at Korea, you tend to see straight swords. That appeals to kind of the Confucian virtue of harmony and perfection in nature. And while Confucianism is absolutely influential in Japanese society, these curved swords begin to emerge due to the influence of the Amishi. The same with the Yumi, the very, very tall longbows. So Minamoto no Yoritomo begins to build a powerful army that he can challenge Taira no Kiyomori with, and he ends up doing so. We call the resulting conflict the Genpei War. Now, in the romanization, it has an N, just like the word senpai or upperclassman, if you ever watched any anime with that word in it. But we pronounce it with an M sound. Right? The Genpei War was fought between the Taira and the Minamoto at the end of the 12th century. And so you have this massive civil war between these two samurai families, and the Minamoto ultimately end up being victorious. They win a battle called the Battle of Dan no Ura, and it's a very epic battle. The young emperor Antoku, who at the time of the battle was only 6 years old, he ended up actually with his mother and his servants. He jumped into the ocean in the strait, dividing Honshu and Kyushu, and he drowned. Right? So he committed suicide at 6 years of age, despite the fact that he was the emperor of Japan. And in fact, this affected, he was Taira no Kiyomori's grandson, but this deeply affected the Minamoto and caused caused them to become disconcerted because they still worshiped the emperor, even if they were fighting against the political faction in control of the imperial house, the Taira clan. So Yoritomo, Minamoto no Yoritomo, ended up taking personal responsibility for the death of this young boy and took it very, very hard because this was blasphemous. It was an atrocity that this young man ended up suffering like that. And so they began to revere little Emperor Antoku as a water god, as a deity. That this idea is that he joins with his ancestors and becomes a Shinto deity of the sea to protect people from drowning. And eventually a shrine is built off the coast of where the battle took place called the Akama Shrine. And you can go there today. It still has visitors who come to pay their respects to young Emperor Antoku. Taira no Kiyomori dies before the end of the Genpei War, so he does not live to see his clan defeated. Nonetheless, the Taira are ultimately crushed, and the Minamoto take control of the emperor and become the ruling authority in Japan. They establish something called the Kamakura Shogunate. So Japan has two capitals. It has the official capital at Kyoto, where the emperor lives and conducts the rituals that keep society safe from famine, earthquakes, fires, tsunamis, and is society's link to the gods, and is officially the object of reverence for everyone in Japan. But the actual running of the government, the running of the provinces, military affairs, taxation, construction, etc., all take place at Kamakura, at the new capital constructed by Minamoto no Yoritomo. So, Minamoto no Yoritomo had gained great fame as a warrior. His brother, Yoshitsune, was an even more famed warrior who ultimately ended up actually turning against uh, Yoritomo, and which was another massive blow to Yoritomo's psychological well-being, despite the fact that he was enjoying now ultimate power. And we call this system a shogunate. Uh, Minamoto no Yoritomo took the title of Dai Shogun, the great dictator. Right? He is the chieftain, the great general of all of Japan, ruling in the emperor's name, ostensibly to take the burden of day-to-day rule away from the emperor, though he's actually ruling as an absolute dictator. So the shogunate establishes a system in which land is parceled out. It's taken away from members of much of the imperial nobility, handed out to the different samurai families, and the samurai rule as hereditary nobles over local provinces. So you will have small landholders, samurai, who owe military service to a larger lord, who then will owe service to another lord, who then will owe service to another lord, who then will owe service directly to the shogun. So power and land are distributed out in a way that all radiate back to the shogun. So we have kind of a dual system. Ironically, we'll end up with kind of a triple puppet system in which the Minamoto clan will actually be displaced by the Hojo clan. Minamoto no Yoritomo's wife, Hojo Masako, was a very, very powerful figure. And when the shogun passes away, Yoritomo, her relatives will begin to become dominant over the Minamoto clan. So you will have a situation where the Hojo end up running the government in the name of the Minamoto, who are the shoguns, who are ruling in the name of the emperor, right, who lives in Kyoto. So you actually have 3 degrees of separation between the official government and actual power. And really, only in Japan do we see this kind of behind the scenes government becoming this prominent this early historically. And of course, you can see here the greatest monument of Kamakura, Japan, the Kotoku-in, which is a daibutsu. A daibutsu is a giant statue of Buddha, and this was erected in the 13th century towards the end of the Kamakura Shogunate, but it was erected in Kamakura, Buddhism being very, very prominent in Japanese society, even greater prominence than we see in China, for example. The Japanese society becoming much more thoroughly Buddhist, to the point to where many, many people give up, in the nobility even, give up the consumption of terrestrial animals, which is very common in Buddhist societies. Not so much in China, or Korea even. But in Japan, even the nobility will turn away from eating terrestrial animals and focusing primarily on fish. For the commoners, they were largely forbidden from eating pork, from eating fowl. So if they want to eat animal life, they have to consume fish or sometimes insects, uh, crustaceans in rivers, etc. So we end up with a situation where many will people will go centuries without meat being a prominent part of the diet. In fact, even today, for many elderly Japanese, the uh, their gut biome can't really process beef. So if they eat beef, a lot of the time they'll have digestive problems. So, and that's begun to fade as beef becomes more part of the modern Japanese diet. But traditionally, uh, in the thoroughly Buddhist culture of Japan, consumption of terrestrial animals was seen as something barbaric, except for the occasional samurai hunt. But the samurai were allowed to eat meat, terrestrial animals, due to their particular dharma, right? Just like the kshatriya in India, if you remember that. So if we look at the government, right, there is the emperor at the very top, who is mostly a figurehead who performs a ceremonial and spiritual role as the leader of society. Below him, you have the shogun, who is the day to day governor of the country, who holds real authority to change laws, to dictate to the provinces, to command troops. And below the shogun, you have the daimyo, who are the great landlords, the great samurai who rule large estates, areas the size of a county, of an American county, right? And there are many of them, and they fight with each other, and they maintain order. And below them, you have the samurai, right? Now they're all samurai. The shogun, the daimyo, and the samurai, they're all samurai, kind of the same way that kings and dukes and counts were all knights. But the daimyo and shogun were much higher ranking samurai. The ordinary samurai, rank and file, would sometimes have their own lands, much smaller portion of land, but they would have peasants directly under them, and they would have a great amount of authority over these peasants. In the 17th century, it will become the law of the land that the samurai can kill. Any samurai could kill any peasant for any reason. He didn't have to have a legal justification. He never had to step foot in a court to defend himself. He simply had to inform the local lord, and then eventually even that requirement is done away with. Right. So the samurai will end up with life and death, power of life and death over the ordinary person. So this is a society where the peasants are greatly reduced in power and have no choice but to labor endlessly for their overlords. Okay, so the shoguns will appoint governors called shugo, who will rule in the shogun's name, and they basically will become kind of a first among equals with the great daimyo. They don't quite have the power that a governor would have, like in the modern United States, but they mainly will inform the shogun of what the local lords out in the provinces are up to. And the shoguns themselves will have vast lands out in the provinces, and those will be managed by people called jito, stewards, who help to make sure that the shogun's agricultural properties are yielding him a maximum profit. I apologize for my voice. I have a sore throat right now. Unfortunately, I've had quite a few health problems this semester, in part due to the stress of so many calamities, one after the other. But nonetheless, I hope you'll bear with me. So the emperor is a symbolic figure, and again, when I talk about their armor, you can see how blocky the uh, the different pieces are, right? The pauldrons, the cuirass, right? They're designed to be wide, rather than thick in order to catch arrows. So the values of the samurai gradually replaced the values of the traditional aristocracy. So these samurai represent kind of an indigenous value system that overthrows the Chinese system, right? The imperial Chinese culture that had been adopted by Prince Shotoku. So we move away from an emphasis on scholarship, an emphasis on uh, gentlemanly values, on humaneness, and we move towards strength, uh, devotion, duty, bravery, self-sacrifice. Those become the norms that dominate Japanese society. And even though in the 17th and 18th centuries, after a long period of peace, the samurai would begin to re-embrace these traditional Chinese genteel values, they would remain primarily warriors, right, with a warrior ethos. So we see the development and the establishment of the major feudal clans throughout Japanese society that would later begin to come to blows in the 16th and 17th centuries and cause massive chaos. Uh, the later Japanese clans of the 16th and 17th centuries would claim descent rather, I'm sorry, from the three great families of this period: the Fujiwara, the Minamoto, or the Taira. Right, kind of like I use the analogy of gangs in Chicago. Right, in the 1960s and 70s, you had uh, the BDs and the GDs and the P Stones and the Vice Lords, right? And now you have all these scattered sets, hundreds of them throughout Chicago, and they claim descent from one of those highly centralized gangs that got started in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, right? Even though they're fractured and the entire large scale gang structure has broken down, these smaller local sets still claim descent from these larger organizations of the past. And the same thing is true of the samurai family the families when we get to the Oda clan of Oda Nobunaga, for example, who claimed descent from the Taira, right? Or the Date clan, who claimed descent from the Fujiwara, or the Ashikaga shogunate, who claimed descent from the Minamoto. Right? So these later samurai lords will claim to be the continuation of these great families from this time period. And they are, for the most part. They're the direct descendants of the great houses that were established during this period of time, this period of samurai rule that will last for centuries and centuries and won't end until the later 19th century when Japan modernizes and begins to take on its current form. So I'd like to take a second just to talk about something that's kind of interesting, and those are Japanese beauty standards. This period of time has a very, very interesting set of beauty standards. You can see the summary of the political development, how the imperial family began to lose power with the Fujiwara, and then you have the rise of the samurai, and then you have the result of military government, where the emperor is merely a figurehead. Well, the samurai families had their own aesthetic regarding female beauty. And one of those was to engage in something called oshiroi, which is powdering your face white, completely white, what I would call crayon white or plaster white. And this is still popular to have a semblance of this in female skin tones today in Japan. In fact, this is generally popular throughout East Asia. There is a very popular misconception that this has to do with Western colonialism, that it's an attempt to imitate Caucasian standards of beauty or to emulate Europeans, and nothing could be further from the truth. First of all, the extreme pale skin tone is very dissimilar to that from the skin tone of say, an Anglo-Saxon person like myself, right? Who, the paper white complexion is not the natural complexion of Europeans, right? In fact, it's not the natural complexion of any person because we all have blood, right? And our blood colors our skin. Um, but this kind of extreme whitening is much, it renders the person much lighter than any natural skin tone. And this was very popular even in the Zhou dynasty, as far back before the Qin dynasty, right? So deep into ancient China, women would whiten themselves to an extreme degree and use cosmetics to make themselves, the color of flour, right? And in Japan, this went to extreme degrees with the Japanese samurai. Women would engage in oshiroi, powdering their faces completely white, carrying huge parasols to prevent any tanning whatsoever. They keep any sunlight from darkening them. And on top of this, they would shave their eyebrows off. It was thought that not having eyebrows meant for a more youthful appearance. And they would paint their teeth black. So they would have, and that would contrast starkly with their kind of pitch white faces. So you would have the situation where, somebody they'd open their mouths and their teeth would be completely black. Their faces would be paper white, and they wouldn't have any eyebrows, which to us would be, to most of us living today in 2026, is a very alien form of beauty. But it was very prominent among the samurai. This is how beautiful women, aristocratic women, dressed and carried themselves in this period of time. And again, this has nothing to do with anyone from Europe, which is where people generally try to say that these worldwide beauty standards originated there, either to in the 19th and 20th centuries. Europeans would claim this as a point of as part of a general sense of cultural superiority, and today it's seen as a negative effect of imperialism. In fact, it predates any contact with European peoples, and the most likely reason for this emphasis on extreme fairness in women is because a woman who is that fair complected doesn't have to work, doesn't have to engage in agricultural labor, isn't out in the sun. And as a result, that means that the family is wealthy. The family is high status, right? Because one of the major differences between a wealthy family and a poor one in virtually every pre-industrial society on earth was that women had to work in the fields. And when societies begin to generate enough wealth to where women aren't required to do agricultural labor, their women begin to move into the home, uh, and it's seen as a status symbol, right? And in East Asia, it's the same way. The samurai didn't need the women of their families to be out farming, so the extreme white skin was a sign of that. Foot binding in China, which we're going to talk about in a week or so, it came from the same kind of urge. So it shows that women don't have to be able to do hard work or be on their feet all day. They're allowed to have these small, very dainty feet that were considered attractive. That actually was the result of breaking the arch of the foot, right? And a very horrific practice for many of the women experiencing it. But that's how far people will go to show wealth, right? To show that they're high status. So I just thought that was an interesting aside. In samurai society, the women were considered samurai, as were the men. In fact, that many of the women were taught uh, martial arts, battlefield tactics, due to the fact that if the men were away on campaign while the castle was attacked, the women would have to defend the castle. I'm going to talk about this more when we talk about Sengoku Jidai, the 16th century civil war, in which many female warriors fought in defensive battles, usually using a weapon called a naginata, which is a type of curved, almost a sword blade attached to a pole, and that pole gives soldiers reach. And it was taught to women because they were generally shorter than men, so they would have greater reach in defending castles. So, but we'll talk about that more in the future. You can hear my son playing his video game. It's way too late for this, so he's got to go to bed. Anyway, thank you for listening.